Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to get really granular on a topic that's incredibly timely. We're looking at Islamic financial law, specifically Zakat, and how this ancient institution is supposed to function when a massive modern disaster strikes.
It's a huge challenge. I mean, our source material for this whole discussion really came out of the response to these recent catastrophic floods and storms, and it brought up some incredibly difficult questions for organizations on the ground.
It really did. You have this established framework for Zakat. It's an annual duty, right? It's methodical. There are 8 specific categories for who gets the money, and it's often tied to a calendar.
Right, like Ramadan.
Exactly. And then bam, a superstorm hits. Out of nowhere. It demands an immediate, huge relief effort. Not next Ramadan, but right now.
And that's the core dilemma, isn't it? You have this structured, almost bureaucratic system on one side, and on the other, you have complete chaos and desperate immediate need.
That tension is what we're going to explore. Can Zakat actually work as a rapid response social safety net? Or is it too rigid?
Well, the guidance we're looking at today suggests it has a remarkable sort of built-in flexibility. For this deep dive, we've broken it down into the 4 biggest challenges that come up, all based on the legal recommendations in the source material.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the question of eligibility. Someone loses everything overnight. How do they fit into those 8 classic categories?
Right.
Second is timing. Can you actually pay your zakat early to get cash flowing into a disaster zone immediately?
The proponent question.
Yeah.
Always a big one.
Then third, geography. The disaster hits one part of the country, but the wealth is elsewhere. Can you move zakat funds across regions?
Which goes against the general rule of local distribution.
It does. And finally, and this is maybe the most practical point, the ethical and legal imperative for organization. Because a lack of coordination isn't just inefficient, the sources argue it's actually a violation of a core religious trust.
Okay, let's start with eligibility. This feels like the first wall that any relief organization is going to hit. You know, the Quran lists the 8 categories: the poor, the needy, the collectors, and so on. But when a flood just wipes out an entire community, everyone is suddenly a victim. Are they all automatically eligible? Or does it get more complicated than that?
It gets more complicated, but in a way that's very logical. This is where the prophetic tradition, the Sunnah, becomes absolutely essential. It provides the specific application for the general Quranic rule. So the legal scholars, the fuqaha, they don't try to invent a new 9th category called disaster victims.
They don't just add a new box to tick.
No, exactly. They look for how these victims now fit into the existing boxes, just under these extreme new circumstances.
And the sources point to one specific story, a hadith, that is just perfectly on point here. The story of Kabisa.
Precisely. The account of the companion, Kabisa ibn Mubarak al-Hilali. It's really the cornerstone for this entire discussion. He had taken on a financial burden, a debt for reconciliation, and he went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and asked, "Is it permissible for me to ask for assistance?"
And the Prophet's response wasn't just a simple yes or no, was it? He used it as a teaching moment.
A major one. He emphasized the importance of self-sufficiency, of not asking unless you absolutely have to. He said that asking is only permissible for 3 specific types of people.
Which itself says a lot about the institutional integrity of Zakat. It's not just a handout. It's a structured system with clear rules of eligibility.
It really is. And so he outlined the 3 cases. The first was a person who takes on debt to make peace between 2 groups, a kind of public service.
Okay.
The second was a person whose wealth has been destroyed to the point of poverty. And then the third. The third is the one that's a direct line to our topic today.
This is what the sources call the calamity clause. What was the exact wording? So important.
The Prophet, peace be upon him, said zakat is allowed for a man whose wealth is completely destroyed by a great calamity.
Yeah. And the Arabic phrase used here is asabathu ja.
Asabathuja.
Yes. And ja, the word for calamity, is, it's not a small thing. The scholars define it as a sweeping, destructive, often sudden event that wipes out assets.
So we're not talking about a bad business investment or a minor loss. This is an external, overwhelming event.
Exactly. Think floods, earthquakes, catastrophic fires, a famine that destroys all your livestock and crops.
Eh.
The key is that the financial destruction is comprehensive, or at least very close to it. The event itself is what triggers the eligibility.
It's the catalyst.
It's the catalyst that changes your status.
Mm-hmm.
And this ruling is, well, it's the foundation for any modern organization that wants to use Zakat funds for disaster relief. It's their primary legal justification.
But there was also a limit, wasn't there? The Prophet didn't just say, okay, you can receive Zakat forever. He put a very clear endpoint on the aid, a very practical one. He added that the person can receive Zakat only until he restores his life to a stable state. The Arabic is harayakama.
Harayakama, until he can stand on his own again.
Exactly. This defines Zakat in this context as purely rehabilitative. It's not a pension. It's not welfare. It is emergency funding designed to get you back to a point of stability and independence.
Which is fascinating. It's a built-in exit strategy for aid.
It is.
But what does a stable state actually mean on the ground? In the middle of a disaster zone, how does an aid worker decide, okay, this family is now stable, we need to move the funds to someone else?
That is the million-dollar question for modern administrators. Legally, a stable state means you no longer fit the definition of faqr or miskin, the poor or the needy. It means you have secure shelter, even if it's basic. You have a means of earning a livelihood again. You can afford food and basic necessities without external help.
So the organization's role has to shift. They go from being an emergency provider of, say, food and water, to being a rehabilitation partner helping someone rebuild a small business.
And they have to keep assessing. Because if they continue paying Zakat to someone who has already reached that stable point, they are now misallocating sacred funds.
It's just an incredible piece of guidance. A system for emergency relief, rehabilitation, and responsible resource management, all laid out centuries before we had concepts like FEMA or the Red Cross.
So following that specific ruling from the Hadith of Kabisa, the legal scholars then did the important work of connecting it back to the Quran's 8 categories. They needed to show that a disaster victim isn't some new, separate 9th category.
Right, the system has to be internally consistent.
Precisely. They showed that the disaster simply acts as a trigger, a force that pushes an individual into one or more of the existing recognized categories.
So it's not the fact that you lost your house that makes you eligible. It's the consequence of losing your house.
That's the perfect way to put it. It's all about the consequence. And that consequence almost always makes them fall into the categories of the poor and the needy. We should probably spend a moment on the difference between those two terms, faqr and miskin.
Yeah, they're often used interchangeably, but in Islamic law, there's a technical difference, right?
There is, and the specifics can vary slightly between the schools of law, but there's a general understanding. A faqr is generally someone who has some assets, maybe a little bit of income, but it's not enough to cover their basic needs. Maybe it covers, say, 40% of their expenses. They are consistently struggling.
Okay, so they're below the poverty line, but not completely without resources.
Exactly. Whereas a miskin is usually defined as someone who is destitute. They have next to nothing. They are wholly dependent on others for their survival. A huge calamity, like a flood that washes away your home, your farm, and your savings, can take a person who was financially comfortable one day and turn them into a miskin the next.
That instantaneous, catastrophic shift in their economic status is what qualifies them. It's a transformation.
And there's another category they might fall into as well, garamin, or the debtors.
How does that work in a disaster context?
Well, imagine your house is destroyed. You have to borrow money just to buy food for your children or to get essential medicine or maybe to rent a truck to clear the debris. That debt was incurred as a direct result of the disaster. It's a survival debt. Zakat can be used to pay that off, to free them from this new financial burden that was forced upon them.
So one single event could make a person eligible under multiple categories at once. They could be a miskin because they have nothing left, and a garim because they've had to take on debt to survive.
Exactly. The framework is flexible enough to capture the complex reality of their situation.
Okay, but now we get to what the sources say is the most crucial condition.
Yeah.
The thing that organizations absolutely have to enforce.
Yes, this is the big one. It's the distinction between mere loss and resulting poverty.
Because a disaster doesn't check your bank balance before it hits. It can affect the rich and the poor alike.
And that's the critical point. Let's take a hypothetical. An individual owns 5 properties. One of them, maybe a rental property or a shop, is in the flood zone and is completely destroyed. It's a huge financial loss, no question.
A huge loss.
But they still have 4 other properties. They have significant savings in the bank. Their primary income stream is untouched. Are they poor?
No, They're still wealthy. They've just suffered a loss.
Exactly. And in that situation, for that person to accept zakat is, according to all major scholars, absolutely haram. It is forbidden.
So zakat is not property insurance.
That is the single most important principle here. Zakat is a tool for poverty alleviation, not asset replacement for the wealthy. The destruction of one part of their portfolio doesn't entitle them to zakat if their remaining wealth is still above the nisab, the minimum threshold for paying zakat in the first place.
There's a consensus on this.
An ijma.
A complete consensus among the imams. Zakat is only permissible for those who become genuinely poor or indebted because of the disaster.
This makes the job of an aid organization so much harder.
It does. It means you can't just drive through a devastated neighborhood and hand out aid to everyone whose house is damaged. You have to do a needs assessment, a proper, almost forensic evaluation of each family's situation.
You have to. You have to verify not just the visible loss, but the resulting inability of that family to recover on their own. It's a huge responsibility, but it's essential to ensure that these sacred funds go only to those who are truly entitled to them.
Okay, so we've covered the who, now let's tackle the when. This seems just as critical. As you said, disasters don't follow a schedule. The event that prompted this research happened in Jumada al-Akhirah.
That's right. Several months before Ramadan, which is when many people pay their zakat and when organizations see their biggest influx of donations.
So you have this massive, immediate need for cash, for food, for medicine, for shelter.
Yeah.
But the main funding pipeline isn't set to open for another few months. What do you do?
You're facing a massive liquidity crisis right when you need to be most effective.
Which brings us to the big question. Is that annual zakat cycle, the haul, a hard and fast rule? Or can you pay your zakat early, proponent, to meet an urgent need?
This is where the flexibility of the law really shines. The overwhelming majority view among scholars is that, yes, you absolutely can propone your zakat. The Hanafi and Shafi schools are very clear on this, and they're supported by many early prominent scholars.
And what's their reasoning? How do they justify, I guess, bending the calendar rule?
Their argument is that the needs of the poor and the desperate take precedence over the administrative timeline of the donor. The urgency of the recipient's situation can override the calendar.
Is there a specific legal precedent for this? Something from the time of the Prophet?
There is, and it's the key piece of evidence everyone points to. It's a well-documented hadith about Abbas, the Prophet's uncle. Abbas, may God be pleased with him, went to the Prophet and asked for permission to pay his zakat before the year, the haul, was actually complete.
He wanted to pay early.
He did. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, granted him the concession. Some narrations even mention that he allowed him to pay for 2 years in advance.
Wow. Okay, so that's a direct precedent from the Prophet himself.
It's the legal hinge on which the entire argument for proponent rests. If the Prophet allowed his own uncle to do it, it establishes the principle that the due date is not an unbreakable barrier when there's a compelling reason.
Which gives organizations today the operational flexibility they desperately need in a crisis. They can launch an appeal and say, we have a disaster, pay your zakat now, ahead of schedule, so we can put it to work immediately.
Exactly. But the scholars who permit this, they don't just throw the rules out the window. They attach two very important conditions to it to protect the integrity of the zakat obligation.
Okay, what are those conditions?
The first is the nisab requirement. To pay your zakat early, your wealth must already meet the minimum threshold, the nisab, at the time you make the payment.
So you can't pay zakat on wealth that doesn't exist yet or on wealth that hasn't yet qualified?
Precisely. Let's say your zakat year ends in December. A disaster hits in September. You can pay your zakat in September, but only if your wealth in September is already over the nisab threshold. If your assets don't actually cross the nisab line until November, then your September payment wouldn't be valid as zakat. It would be a voluntary charity, a sadaqah, but not your obligatory zakat.
That makes sense. It ensures the fundamental obligation is already in place, even if the timing is being adjusted. What's the second condition?
The second is the 2-year limit. This comes from those other narrations of the Abbas hadith. The Hanafi school, in particular, argues that while proponent is allowed, you can't just pay it 5 or 10 years in advance. They generally limit it to a maximum of 2 years.
Why is that?
Because paying too far in advance starts to stretch the purpose. Your wealth could change dramatically in 3 or 4 years. The nisab value itself could change. It introduces too much uncertainty and disconnects the payment from the wealth it's supposed to be purifying.
So there's a reasonable limit. Now, you said this was the majority view. Does that mean some schools of law disagree?
Yes, and it's important to acknowledge that. The Maliki and Hanbali schools traditionally held a much stricter position.
What was their argument against proponent?
Their logic was that the completion of the year, the haul, is not just a deadline for payment. They see it as part of the cause, the sabab, of the obligation itself.
So in their view, the obligation to pay zakat doesn't fully exist until two conditions are met. You have the nisab, A&D, a full year has passed.
Exactly. So for them, paying before the year is up is like trying to pay a debt before it's actually been incurred.
That's a very different way of looking at it.
It is. But it's also important to note that even within those schools, many contemporary scholars will allow for exceptions in cases of extreme public need, what's called maslaha or public interest. A widespread famine or a national disaster would certainly qualify as an extreme public need. So in practice, during a crisis like the one we're discussing, you'd find a broad, pragmatic consensus that favors allowing proponent.
So this flexibility is what allows Gilset to function as a dynamic system, providing a surge of cash, of liquidity, right when a community is at its most vulnerable. All right, so we've talked about who can receive zakat and when it can be paid. Now we need to talk about where. This is a huge issue in a national disaster. A hurricane might devastate the coast, but the inland cities where a lot of the country's wealth is concentrated might be completely untouched.
A very common scenario.
The problem is there's a very strong general rule in Islamic law that says you should spend zakat money locally.
Yeah. It's a powerful and foundational principle established by consensus, or ijma. The practice of the Prophet and the early caliphs was to collect zakat from a community and distribute it among the poor of that same community.
And there's a good reason for that, I assume. It builds local solidarity.
It absolutely does. It ensures that local wealth addresses local poverty. It makes the community responsible for its own members and fosters a sense of self-reliance. It prevents capital flight from poor regions. It's a brilliant socioeconomic principle for normal times.
But these aren't normal times. You're in a situation where the local resources in the disaster zone are completely wiped out. The people who used to pay zakat are now the ones who need to receive it. So what happens to the rule then?
Then the rule is overridden by a more urgent principle, the principle of acute need. And this is where, again, the Hanafi school of law provides a really crucial degree of flexibility that has been widely adopted by modern aid organizations.
So what are the justifications the Hanafis give for allowing the transfer of zakat funds from one region to another?
They lay out a few specific circumstances. The first is if a person's poor relatives who are eligible for zakat live in a different town or country, family ties can justify the transfer.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the second one is the game changer for disaster relief.
Yeah.
They permit the transfer if the destination area has a significantly greater need than the area where the zakat was collected.
And a national disaster is the textbook definition of significantly greater need.
The absolute textbook definition. If you have Region A, which is unaffected and has, let's say, a baseline level of poverty, and Region B, which has just been hit by an earthquake and has mass homelessness and destitution, the scale of need in Region B is exponentially higher.
So the need in Region B essentially creates a moral and legal claim on the surplus wealth in Region A.
That's a good way to frame it. The primary objective of zakat is to alleviate suffering and poverty. If sticking rigidly to the local distribution rule means leaving people to starve in Region B while the poor in Region A are adequately cared for, then the rule is actually preventing zakat from achieving its main purpose.
But what about the local poor in Region A? Is it fair to take the money that was meant for them and send it somewhere else? How did the scholars balance that?
That's an excellent question. The guidance isn't to just drain Region A of all its zakat funds and leave the local poor with nothing. The more nuanced position is that you first ensure the needs of the local poor in Region A are met. Then, the surplus can be transferred. Or, if the need in Region B is so catastrophic, a portion of the funds can be moved immediately with a proportional logic. It's about prioritizing the most severe crisis.
It's a triage system for resources. You direct the funds to where life and livelihood are most immediately threatened.
Exactly. And this isn't just a historical opinion. The source material mentions a major contemporary study on this. The Kuwait Beit al-Zakat, which is a leading zakat institution, did extensive research and formally concluded that transferring zakat is absolutely permissible in cases of severe anartham, which means a devastating disaster or calamity, and pasi patinika, which means famine or mass starvation.
So we have a strong contemporary consensus backing this up.
A very strong one. The Maliki school also allows for it in cases of severe need, and it's the standard operating procedure for virtually all major international Islamic charities today.
The implication, then, is clear. In the face of an overwhelming crisis, Zakat becomes a national or even international resource pool. Borders and regions become secondary to the geography of human suffering. Okay, we've gone through the big legal questions, the who, the when, and the where. But now we have to get to the ground level, to the actual act of distribution. And the sources are pretty scathing about what happened in the disaster that prompted this research. They describe distribution chaos.
That's a good term for it. A total lack of coordination. You had dozens of different groups, local mosques, national NGOs, even just individuals with trucks full of supplies all rushing into the same area.
And the result was this massive duplication of effort. One street gets, 100 packets of food aid per house, while the next street over gets absolutely nothing.
It's a classic problem in disaster relief, but from an Islamic legal perspective, it's more than just inefficient. It's a serious breach of trust.
How?
Well, think about what's happening when someone gives their zakat to an organization. They are delegating a religious obligation. They are giving those funds with a specific intention, a niyah, that the money will be delivered correctly and completely to someone who is eligible.
So the organization isn't just a delivery service. They are now carrying the weight of that person's act of worship.
They are carrying a sacred trust, an amana, and the responsibility to fulfill it properly. That's a kadamai, a serious religious duty.
So if that organization, through its own disorganization, wastes the funds or lets supplies spoil or delivers them to the wrong people, what are the consequences?
The consequences are huge. On a spiritual level, the person or institution responsible for that waste is bearing a great sin. They failed in their duty. And there's a real question as to whether the donor's obligation has even been properly fulfilled.
So the donor's zakat might not even count.
It's a gray area. But if the failure is due to clear negligence or tafrit on the part of the intermediary, the donor has done their part by paying, but the system has failed. The sin falls squarely on the intermediary. And it might not just be a spiritual consequence. Many scholars would argue that if an organization wastes zakat funds through negligence, they are financially liable. They may have to replace the wasted funds from their own non-zakat operational budget.
Wow. That would certainly make organizations take logistics a lot more seriously.
It should. The threat of financial liability for mismanagement enforces a level of diligence that's absolutely required.
So, to avoid this chaos and this breach of trust, the sources demand a highly structured, coordinated approach. What are the steps they lay out?
They outline a three-step process that requires communication and data. The very first step is factoring in state aid.
Meaning, don't just rush in. First, see what the government is already doing.
Exactly. An organization cannot operate in a bubble. Before you spend a single dollar of zakat money, you need to find out what the government or other huge agencies like the UN are providing. If the state is handling the distribution of basic food rations and clean water, then you don't spend your zakat on more rice and water bottles. That leads to waste.
You redirect your funds to fill the gaps.
You fill the gaps, you focus on things the government isn't providing. Maybe that's specialized medicine or trauma counseling or materials to rebuild small businesses. It requires strategic thinking, not just a knee-jerk reaction.
Okay, that's step one. What's next?
Step two is probably the hardest. It's coordinated assessment, or in the language of the source, kanipidu. This means all the different groups working in the area, the mosques, the NGOs, the community centers, they must talk to each other. They have to share information.
They need a central database, essentially.
They need a central database, a shared map. Who has been helped? What did they receive? Which neighborhoods still haven't been reached? What are the specific needs in each location? Is it food? Is it shelter? Is it medical supplies?
That seems almost impossible in the chaos of a disaster zone, with no power and no internet.
It is incredibly difficult. But the religious obligation to not waste zakat funds demands it. The imperative for organization means you have to find a way. Today, that means using technology offline apps, shared spreadsheets, whatever it takes to avoid that duplication of effort. Without a shared kanapadu, a shared assessment, you are flying blind, and waste is almost guaranteed.
And the third step, it's about looking past the immediate crisis.
It is. The third step is balancing needs. You have to divide your resources thoughtfully between immediate, life-saving aid and long-term rehabilitation.
So food and medicine today, but also a plan for rebuilding homes tomorrow.
Right. You can't forget the Hada Yaquema principle we talked about, bringing people back to a stable state. Immediate needs are critical. Food, water, shelter, medical care. But if you only focus on that, you create a cycle of dependency. So a portion of the zakat funds must be allocated from day one for the long-term work. Rebuilding a fisherman's boat, replacing a carpenter's tools, providing the seed money for a shopkeeper to restock their store.
That must create some incredibly difficult choices. When you have limited funds, do you pay for one person's life-saving surgery now, or use that same money to rebuild a house that will give a family of 10 stability for the next 20 years?
It's a profound ethical dilemma, and there are no easy answers. The administrators have to use their best judgment. Generally, saving a life will always take precedence. But the long-term plan can't be an afterthought. It has to be part of the initial strategy. To neglect the rehabilitation phase is to fail to complete the objective of Zakat, which is to restore dignity and self-sufficiency, not just to keep people alive in a state of destitution. Hashtag
So as we wrap up, this has been a fascinating deep dive. It's really shown how a system like Zakat, which is, over 1,400 years old, has this incredible built-in resilience and flexibility to deal with very modern problems.
It really does. We've seen how the legal framework identifies disaster victims by their resulting poverty, slotting them into existing categories like miskin or fakir.
And we saw the critical flexibility on timing, the ability to propone payments based on the precedent of the Prophet's uncle, Abbas.
As long as that core nisab requirement is met, of course, and then the ability to move funds across regions, overriding the local rule when there's an overwhelming acute need somewhere else.
But I think the most powerful takeaway for me was that final point on organization, that it's not just a matter of good practice or efficiency. The demand for coordination for that canopy due is a religious duty. Mismanaging aid is a breach of a sacred trust.
It elevates logistics to the level of a religious obligation. It shows a system designed for comprehensive, practical, and accountable relief, even in the most chaotic circumstances imaginable.
Which leaves us with a final, I think, very provocative thought for you, our listeners, to take away. The sources place this immense religious weight, this catami, on the need for coordination and accountability to prevent waste. So the question is this: how can modern technology be harnessed to fulfill this ancient religious imperative?
A fascinating question.
Think about it. Could you use something like blockchain to create a completely transparent donation trail so a donor knows exactly which family received their zakat and what it was used for? Could we use AI-powered satellite imagery and real-time data from cell phones to create an instant, accurate needs map of a disaster zone, telling organizations precisely where to go and what to bring? How do we merge this profound ethical guidance with the tools of modern data science to ensure not a single penny is wasted and the religious obligation is fulfilled to its absolute fullest potential?
That's where the future of this work lies, I think.
Something to think about. We'll leave you there. Until next time, keep digging deeper.